Job, Rethinking Satan and the so-called divine council. In the book of Job, we meet Satan. But what if this figure isn't a literal being? What if Job wasn't written to describe spiritual warfare, but instead to explore themes of suffering, integrity, and human faith under pressure? And what if the popular idea of a divine council has more to do with modern assumptions than ancient Hebrew thought? Let's break it all down. See, Job is wisdom literature. It's not a supernatural battle story. It's not categorized with the historical books of the Bible. The book of Job belongs to the Hebrew wisdom tradition, along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. It's poetic and philosophical. It's not apocalyptic or myth based. Job is asking deep moral questions, not describing cosmic battles. And one thing to consider is that the Satan in Job never opposes God. He doesn't tempt, he doesn't lie, he doesn't rebel. He shows up in chapters 1 and 2 and then vanishes. So this Satan is not God's enemy in the story of Job. He's operating within God's permission, fulfilling a narrative role. So let's go ahead and read Job chapter 1 verse 6 and then break this down. And it reads, "The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." So first thing I like to point out in this verse is that Satan in Hebrew is a title, not a name. In the Hebrew, it's Hasatan, which means the adversary, the accuser, or the challenger. It's a job description, not a personal name. And to validate my point, the word Satan is used for angels, people, and even God in Scripture. Numbers 22:22, for example. Angel of the Lord is a Satan, an adversary, to Balaam. In 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 14, God raises up a Satan against Solomon to bring forth a judgment on Solomon as a human being. In 2 Samuel 24 verse 1, we cross-reference that with 1 Chronicles 21:1. See, one says God incited David, the other says the Satan did it. And in Matthew 16 verse 23, Jesus calls Peter Satan for standing in his way. And then he goes on to explain why. Because he was opposing the plans of God unknowingly and not with ill intention, but he was. So in scripture, Satan simply means opponent, and that role is sometimes played by humans, angels, or even God's own actions. It's not necessarily a bad thing, like we see with Numbers 22. The angel of the Lord was opposing Balaam because Balaam was going to go and curse Israel. So it's not necessarily good or bad. It depends on the context. But again, Satan simply means an adversary, an opponent. Now let's look at the phrase before the Lord. Before the Lord refers to earthly gatherings. When we read before the Lord in Job 1:6, most seem to assume that this is in a heavenly realm and a heavenly courtroom. But if we take a look further into the before the Lord phrase within scripture, it usually refers to earthly gatherings, not heavenly ones. Deuteronomy 19:7, for example. Two men stand before the Lord, before the judges, before the priests, those who the Spirit of God rests upon. In 1 Samuel 1, verse 22, a child is brought before the Lord at the tabernacle. In 1 Samuel 2, verse 18, it says, "But Samuel ministered before the Lord," in the temple setting. And in Joel 1:14, people gather before the Lord, also in the temple. This phrase is used for worship and legal settings on earth, not divine staff meetings in heaven. Now, let's take a look at sons of God. Sons of God, many people assume, are supernatural angelic beings. But if we study this phrase a little further, we'll find that it usually refers to human beings, not supernatural beings. The phrase sons of God appears 5 times in the Old Testament and 6 times in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it always refers to people, like in John 1:12, Romans 8:14, Galatians 3:26. And in the Old Testament, it also refers to humans, like in Hosea 1:10. Israel's called sons of the living God. And in Exodus 4:22, Israel is my first son, my firstborn. Now, there are 2 or 3 places where some argue it may refer to supernatural angels. But if we further examine these passages, it makes more sense that it refers to humans rather than supernatural angels. Let's take Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, for example, where it reads, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives." And here it shows that they reproduced, they had children. But the supernatural angelic view clashes with other parts in scripture. See, Matthew 22, verse 30, Jesus says angels do not marry. And in Genesis 1:25, everything reproduces after its own kind. The sons of God in Genesis likely refers to human rulers or judges, not divine beings. And this is usually the case. And although the Job passage didn't mention angels, I wanted to touch up on this just to further drive my point. See, angels can also refer to human messengers as well, not just spirits. The Hebrew word malach and the Greek word angelos, which is where we get the word angel from, both mean messenger. That's the literal meaning of the word. They refer to both spiritual beings and human figures, depending on the context, like Malachi 2:7. The priest is called a malach, an angel of the Lord. Haggai 1:13, Haggai is the Lord's messenger. That's the word malach. But yet we know it's a human prophet. In 2nd Chronicles 36, verses 15 and 16, God sent messengers, malachim, right? Word for angels, referring to human prophets. Job 33, verse 23, a messenger, a malach, is described as a mediator, possibly a teacher or a wise man. And we see in the Greek New Testament, Luke 7, verse 24, John's disciples are called angeloi, messengers, angels. In James 2, verse 25, Rahab welcomed the angelus, clearly human beings, with the same word for angel. So malach and angelos simply mean messenger and often refer to people. Now let's consider the divine council for a second. The divine council theory isn't in the Hebrew Bible. The phrase divine council never appears in the original Hebrew. Some translators insert this, but simply not there. God needing advisors contradicts biblical monotheism, and Jewish tradition never interpreted Job's opening as a heavenly boardroom of gods or angels. The divine council theory is an imported concept influenced by mythology, not grounded in scripture. The idea of an independent evil entity developed much later and doesn't reflect the original Hebrew worldview found in books like Job. But with that said, I do believe in angels, I do believe in the supernatural, but I also believe in reading scripture as it was written, not as later traditions imagined it. This isn't about rejecting the Bible, it's about letting the Bible define its own terms. To conclude, Job isn't about a cosmic war. It's not about a literal devil or a divine council. It's about the heart of human suffering and whether we can stay faithful when everything is stripped away. When we see Satan as a literary role, not a rogue being, and understand sons of God and before the Lord as symbolic or temple-based phrases, we return to the Hebrew roots. We peel back the mythological layers and we rediscover what Job has always been, a deeply human, deeply divine exploration of integrity, loss, and trust. Thank you for listening. God bless.